Good morning. My name is Mark Taylor, and I serve as the Director of Government Operations for Boeing in California. Boeing is delighted to be the sponsor of Accelerate Long Beach Space and Technology. As the largest aerospace employer in Long Beach, we play a huge role in this local economy, supporting thousands of jobs as well as spending $86 million annually with our 40 local suppliers. So I'm thrilled to be here with you this morning and want to thank all of you for taking the time to be here. It's my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Dr. Robert Kleinhenz. A leading voice on the economy at the national, state, and local levels, Robert brings more than 3 decades of experience to his economic studies and policy analysis. He is a frequent contributor on CNBC, Bloomberg, NPR, and other media outlets across the country. He leverages data-informed forecasts to help people understand what's happening in different industry sectors and where the economy is headed. Robert is a University of Southern California graduate, an adjunct professor of economics, and the associate director of the Office of Economic Research at Cal State Long Beach. He is also the founder of the firm Kleinhenz Economics and previously served as the executive director of research with Beacon Economics. He was also the chief economist for the Los Angeles County Economic Development Corporation and deputy chief economist with the California Association of Realtors. Believing that knowledge is power, he strives to help local business leaders and the community at large feel more certain about what's ahead. We're grateful to have him here with us today. Take it away, Dr. Kleinhenz.
Thank you, Mark. Hello, everyone. I'm here to talk about the economy. Of course, this is the Economic Forum for the second quarter of this year. I'll be talking about the U.S. and California economy. Here we are, June 17th, just a couple days after the reopening of the state economy. And so there's no better time than right now to take a look at where we've been and to take a look at where we're headed. So with that in mind, we'll be talking about the U.S. economy, where recovery is well underway. Many other parts of the country reopened before California more fully reopened in these last couple of days. But California is ramping up, and so as you'll see, we expect to see that when we move further through the year, 2021 and into 2022, we'll see recovery really take hold throughout California. So let's begin by taking a look at what's happening now in the United States economy. And you know, there are many different news streams that we all follow, but they all seem to revolve these days around a handful of hot topics, one of which is how soon the U.S. economy is going to fully recover. What about inflation? What about interest rates? And what about the deficit? So let's take each of these in turn, and we'll have a similar sort of set of questions for the California economy. So how soon will we recover? Well, we've got good news on that front, at least as far as economic activity is concerned. Over on the left-hand side, you can see GDP by level. So $19.3 trillion on the far left-hand side was the level of economic activity just before the Great Recession. And those next two bars that you're looking at show what happened during the first half of last year when we lost $2 trillion of economic activity. But soon after that, moving into the second half of last year and into the first quarter of this year, we've seen that the economy has been in a recovery mode. It's been adding to GDP. And we fully expect recovery of lost GDP by the second quarter of this year. So that's you know, the end of June of this year. So that's good news. And over on the right-hand side, you can see the annual growth rates for GDP. We've been averaging about 2.5% growth for the last several years leading into the pandemic downturn. Last year, we lost GDP to the tune of 3.5%, the biggest drop since the 1940s. So indeed, it was a severe but very sharp and short-lived decline, really limited to that first half of last year. And since then, we've been growing nicely. And for all of 2021, we expect to see the fastest pace of growth we've seen in about 35 years. So 6.5% is what you see here, and even that's a conservative outlook. And next year also will be a year of above average growth. So the trajectory from this point forward doesn't just look promising, it's really more on the optimistic side, at least as far as economic activity is concerned. Now, part of that is driven by consumer spending. Consumers make up 2/3 of the spending in the economy. And what you see here is, again, in that first half of last year, consumer expenditures pulled back. That's what you're looking at with those red bars. The pullback in spending really hit services hard. So here we're talking about the things we've heard so much about. We're talking about restaurants, we're talking about entertainment venues, personal services and the like. And that segment of consumer spending has yet to recover. But even as we were not spending our funds, our money on those things, we were spending money on consumer goods. So buying cars, buying home appliances, any number of other things to equip the home in which we found ourselves spending so much time. And so goods spending actually really took off and continues to be elevated at this point in time. That'll likely level out some as we go through the next several quarters, and we'll see real recovery happen with respect to services. So all of that's good news for the economic activity measures that we typically track, notably gross domestic product or GDP. Even the unemployment rate has improved quite a bit over the last several months, so that's good news, but the labor market has a ways to go before it's fully recovered. So on the left-hand side, you can see during the pandemic shutdown, the unemployment rate rose sharply from 3.5% to 14.8%. So that's what happened in the labor market. And on the jobs front, the wage and salary job count for the U.S. economy fell from about 153 million jobs to about 130 million jobs, so a loss of 22 million jobs over the span of just 2 months. Now, we've clawed back quite a few of those jobs, and we're still about 8 million short. We will recover those jobs in the next several quarters, but it's likely to be sometime in 2022 before we fully recover the jobs that were lost during the spring 2020 pandemic shutdown. And that unemployment rate, it's now 5.8%. We fully expect to see that improve in the coming months, even as the labor force grows when people go back to work or back to looking for work. But we expect to see that the unemployment rate could easily drop below 5% as we close out 2021 and move into 2022. In fact, if all of the leisure and hospitality workers in the United States that are out of work currently were able to go back to work immediately, the unemployment rate would actually drop considerably from the 5.8% that you see here right now. And that just points to the importance of seeing that particular sector heal. It was where most of the jobs were lost during the pandemic shutdown, and it's also the area where that has been the slowest to recover. Now, there have been concerns about the pace of recovery. The Fed has even said that it's expecting somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 million jobs created per month as we move through the recovery phase. To me, that's a bit on the optimistic side. If you take a look at our most recent experience, the Great Recession, in the months since jobs bottomed out, that's what we're looking at here. In the 13 months after job counts bottomed out, both in the Great Recession and in the pandemic shutdown, we saw job growth during the Great Recession, or in the aftermath of the Great Recession, to the tune of about 122,000 jobs per month. Now, so far in these last 13 months that we're talking about here for the pandemic, we've added jobs to the tune of 1.1 million. But as you see, we had a big spike back in June. That would have been June, the second month there, of 2020. If you take that out, you take out that big spike that occurred then, we're looking at average job growth somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 to 600,000 per month. That seems like a more likely target for us. And with that in mind, and with 8 million jobs to be recovered, it looks like sometime in 2022, maybe by the end of the second quarter of 2022, we may fully recover the jobs that were lost. To expect 1 million jobs per month in this recovery mode, I think, would be quite exceptional. So we're on the road to recovery, whether we're looking at economic activity or we're looking at jobs or other kinds of economic indicators. We're also concerned about inflation. There are a lot of questions about inflation and interest rates, so let's take a look at those. Here you're looking at annual inflation rates for the last several years, and over on the far right-hand side you can see the year-to-date inflation figure, which is 3%. In April, the most recent available data, we saw that overall inflation based on the CPI was up by 5%, but Really, for all of this year, we think that inflation is going to be in the 3 to 3.5% range. This current spike that we're seeing with the CPI and with some of the producer prices climbing so high, these are all likely to be transitory effects as we work out the kinks in the supply chain, as supply catches up with demand. These kinds of things inevitably occur as we come out of a downturn and recover. And evidence of that from the Great Recession is on the far left-hand side of your screen, where you can see that in 2011, when we were finally making our way forward in recovering from the Great Recession, inflation that year was a little over 3%. So runaway inflation, not in the cards. Elevated inflation for the next several months, very likely, but still in the single-digit range. The key is that our inflation expectations don't get too far ahead of things, because if our inflation expectations, that is to say our expectations for the inflation rate in the future, get out of hand, then we have an additional concern. Core inflation also appears here. It's very much in control, below 3%. We expect it to be in the neighborhood of 2.5% over the balance of this year. So the inflation situation looks good, even despite the worries that have been expressed in so many reports lately. And that's also important for interest rates. Interest rates, in part, depend on the expected rate of inflation. They also depend on economic growth, or the expectation of economic growth. So we're expecting the economy to grow. We're also expecting some inflation. So there should be some lift in interest rates in the coming months. But again, nothing that is going much beyond low single-digit interest rates, really fundamentally reflecting the fact that the economy is recovering and growing. So higher interest rates are in the cards. Interest rates that are going through the roof, definitely not in the cards. So the expectation is that we'll be just fine over the next several months. And we're still in a very low interest rate environment. Historically low interest rates, if you take a look at the 30-year mortgage, which appears here in green, and you take a look at the yield on the 10-year Treasury. Worries about the deficit. Well, what about the deficit? In 2020, we had a $3 trillion plus federal budget deficit. In 2021, the projection as of February was about $2.5 trillion. It's likely to push past $3 trillion this year. But then in the next several years, we're expecting to see that the budget deficit will retreat to the neighborhood of $1 trillion. That's about 4% of GDP. That's equivalent to about 4% of GDP, which is right in line with the long-run 40-year average that we've seen. So as far as that's concerned, the fact that the deficit's going to return to the kinds of background levels that we've seen over the last several decades, that's a good thing. Now, the deficit is indeed higher than it used to be. And the concerns going forward are, how are we going to pay for it? Well, interest rates right now are very low, so paying that deficit or servicing the national debt is relatively cheap. The question is, does it crowd out any kind of other activity, other spending that might benefit U.S. residents? If it does, then we should be concerned about it. When times are good, not now, but when times are good, when we're expanding as an economy, then that's when we should be looking at relying less on deficit spending and maybe bringing our balances more current. But that's not a concern for today, not a concern for 2021, likely not a concern in 2022. So the U.S. economy is on track with its recovery. By the second quarter, by the end of this month, we expect a fully recovered GDP. The labor market's looking good. All of this is good when we look at California's picture through the U.S. lens. So how big has the hit been to the California economy, and how soon will the state's economy recover? We've heard a lot about the decline in population in recent weeks, and over the last several years, of course, we're constantly hearing about companies leaving California. So the question is, has California lost its competitive edge? We'll talk about that in just a minute. And then we'll finish up by talking about housing. So how big was the hit to California? not unlike the U.S., we saw the unemployment rate skyrocket in the months of spring 2020. We saw the unemployment rate before the pandemic disruption in the neighborhood of 4%. It basically quadrupled to 16% in the span of just a couple of months. We lost 2.5 million jobs over that time period. I should say 2.7 million jobs, of which we've recovered about 1.3 million so far, so a little bit less than half. So the California economy is definitely moving in the right direction, but it's moving more slowly than the U.S. because we've been much more restrictive and conservative in our approach to dealing with the pandemic. So June 15th was a very important day because so much of California, which had been under various kinds of restrictions, is now fully or nearly fully open. So we expect the next several months to be a time period where California's economy really takes off. So you can see on the right-hand side, the unemployment rate is currently at 8.3%, so it's about half where it was during the worst days of the pandemic's shutdown last spring. You can see that the job picture is quite a bit improved, 16.3 million jobs. So we have about 1.4 million jobs to recover. We've recovered about 40% of the jobs lost so far to date. And you can see how that compares with the U.S. picture. So the U.S. as a whole has recovered about 2/3 of the jobs that it lost during the pandemic shutdown last spring. As I mentioned during my remarks on the U.S. picture, leisure and hospitality was the hardest hit, and it still has the biggest gap. So it accounts for the largest number of those 1.4 million jobs that we have yet to recover, followed by government. So in that case, what happened was that state and especially local government anticipated that their revenue streams were going to just dry up during the pandemic. And so as a result, they began to lay workers off. And so there have been job losses at all levels of government, but especially at the local level over the last several months. The budget picture looks much better for both, obviously for the state and also for local government. So we expect to see that 213,000 job loss figure close or be reduced rather quickly. Other services includes things like getting your hair cut, nail salons, things like that. And as you know, the health restrictions that were in place during the shutdown really limited our ability to take advantage of those services. So again, that's one of those areas of the economy that was hard hit. We expect to see it recover just as fast as people are comfortable with getting out there and engaging in face-to-face activities with so many individuals that provide these personal services. If there's one area of the economy that has done well through all of this, it's transportation and warehousing. With all of us sitting at home and working from home, more and more of us relied quite a bit more heavily on online purchases. And so that's just given rise to elevated job levels in distribution, warehousing, of course, shipping. And so transportation and warehousing has done well. It was the one sector of the economy that really added jobs over the year 2020, even as so many other sectors of the economy lost jobs. We continue to be worried about households, especially households that have either no jobs or have limited pay to help them cover their bills. Small businesses are also still struggling. And keep in mind that a lot of the small businesses are also in those very industries that you see over on the left-hand side, delivering personal services, opening restaurants or running restaurants, things like that. So as those sectors of the economy get going again, we would expect to see the fortunes improve for small business. Female labor force participation has been a real concern during the pandemic. With kids having to take their schooling at home, somebody in the family has had to stay at home with them. So the adults in the household, oftentimes it's been women who've stayed at home, who have left the labor force. So we're hopeful that labor force participation on the part of women is going to improve in the coming months as we find kids returning to school. The bottom line is that California has been recovering a bit more slowly than the U.S. Up to this point, we really expect to see recovery acceleration in the state as we go through the balance of the year, not just because we've reopened as of June as of June 15th, but also because some of our very important sources of growth, some of our leading industries, including tech and transportation and so on, are likely to really take off as we get further into this year and move into 2022. When you look across the regions of California, you see a varied picture. And the bottom line is that unlike most past economic downturns, where the California coast led the way in recovery, in this economic recovery, we've seen many inland regions lead the way. So at the very top, you see that Stockton Lodi has already recovered about 3/4 of the jobs that it lost during the shutdown. The Inland Empire, about 2/3. You have to go all the way down to the bottom of the list to see that LA County has only recovered about 1/3, 36% of the jobs that it lost during the shutdown. So we have a ways to go here in Los Angeles County. But again, we need to understand why we're looking at that number. And that's because we have a high concentration of employment in arts and entertainment, in other aspects of leisure and hospitality. So that tourism part of our economy, as that comes back to life in the next several weeks, we expect to see that job growth is going to pick up, and in particular, leisure and hospitality will pick up, and some of the other important sectors of the LA County economy will pick up, and that's going to help Long Beach as well. It turns out that California, even with the restrictions, has been tracking fairly closely with the U.S. in terms of GDP activity, gross domestic product. And so we really expect to see that California is going to recover lost economic activity probably sometime later on this year, so maybe a quarter or two behind the U.S. in terms of its trajectory. And then as far as the unemployment rate is concerned, we would expect to see sometime in 2022, maybe a little bit later than the U.S. as a whole, that the unemployment rate is going to come down and probably drop below 5%. So, we've got good news. We're cautiously optimistic about where the economy is going. But at this stage, it's a huge improvement over the circumstances that we've seen in the last several months. So what about California's competitive edge? So we're going to look at two things. One, we're going to look at population, and two, we're going to look at the story as it relates to the state's businesses. So first, you probably heard that California lost population in 2021 based on the latest estimate for the first time in about 100 years. So here you see the population for the state, 39.5 million. We lost about 182,000 in population from 2020 to 2021. First time in 100 years that this has occurred. So all sorts of alarm signals have gone up. Well, let's take a look and see what's actually happened. And we don't have data for 2021 in this figure, but I think we can figure out what happened in 2021 based on the recent history over the last several years. So here you've got the components of population change for the state. We have natural increases, which are due to the difference between births and deaths. That appears here in blue. And then we have net change in migration, which is the sum of state-to-state migration and international in-migration. So even before the pandemic hit, we saw that the natural increase in California was slowing, partly due to the fact that we've got a slightly older population, so we have fewer childbirths that are occurring. And so that's part of the reason why those blue bars are getting smaller. And in the pandemic year, 2020, of course, that blue bar really dropped. So both because we were seeing fewer births and also because we were seeing elevated deaths, okay? So then what really makes the difference is this net change due to migration. For years, we've had international in-migration offset state-to-state outflows so that on balance, we end up with a population gain. But you can see in the last couple of years, we actually have lost population as a result of migration. You move into 2021, you've got the slower natural growth rate coupled with heightened levels of outmigration, and those taken together gave rise to a 0.5% decline of 182,000 persons in our population growth rate. We really expect that this is going to turn around as we move into 2022. The sources of growth will recover. if there's any chance that we can rework our immigration policy, a problem which is probably decades overdue, that will help California because we need a sound immigration policy to enable the immigrants that make up our economy and contribute not just to our population but to our overall economic activity. We need that source of growth in the California economy going forward. So we expect to see a turnaround in population in 2022. As for the notion that businesses are leaving California because it's a less competitive environment than other places around the country, well, there's obviously some truth to that. But when you look at certain numbers, it really becomes evident that we continue to be a very dynamic economy. Here you're looking at new business establishments. That's the black line. So on average over the last several years, using the left-hand side axis, you can see that California has added about 180,000 new businesses each year for the last several years. The latest data, as you see here, is 2019. Now, businesses go out of business as well. So I'm also showing you the net gain in new establishments, which is the blue bars, and you can see that we add about 30,000 new businesses each year here in the state of California. So we continue to have a vibrant, dynamic economy here in California. Entrepreneurship is very much alive, and if you just take a look at one indicator to tell you what's happening here, take a look at venture capital. This is last year's venture capital, and in the United States, a total of $133 billion of venture capital was distributed across the states, of which about half came here to California. Now, a large portion of that went to the Bay Area, somewhere in the neighborhood of, say, 50 billion. Another 10 billion came to Los Angeles County, with the balance sort of distributed between San Diego, Orange County, and other parts. But the bottom line is that if this weren't a place where growth happens, where new ideas are turned into commercial reality, we wouldn't see the flow of venture capital to the state of California that you're seeing here. So we can't believe everything we read, and even the things that we do read that have some credibility, we definitely need to get more context in order to better understand what we're learning. So what about housing? Well, this is also a topic that's very much in the news. Home sales as well as home prices seemingly are going through the roof. Home prices, so the April home price for California was up 34% to over $800,000, and sales were up 65%. But keep in mind that April was we were comparing April against the trough in sales that you see for the year ago time period when we were going through the worst days of the spring pandemic shutdown. So as we move through the rest of the year, we're likely to see both smaller percentage gains in home prices and smaller percentage gains in home sales as well. So this is going to be an okay, maybe a good year for home sales and certainly for home prices. It's a seller's market, if you want to use that term. And part of that has to do with the fact that the supply of homes continues to be extremely lean. But let's not forget that low interest rates really benefit would-be home buyers greatly. And so that's why we're seeing such demand for homes at the present time. But even with very low interest rates, and we expect that to continue to be the case for the foreseeable future, you can see here that affordability has fallen. So for Los Angeles County, a year ago, first quarter of 2020, 31% of households could afford the median priced home. Shift forward to the first quarter of this year, January through March of this year, the share of households that could afford the median priced home had fallen to a quarter. And you can see why when you take a look at the numbers. The median home price in the first quarter was about $680,000. The monthly payment was in the neighborhood of $3,100. And with that monthly payment, the minimum required income was about $124,000, well above the median household income for households in Los Angeles County. And you can see the numbers for the rest of the region as well as for the state and for the U.S. Let's face it, we're in a high-cost region, we're in a high-cost state, and there's no easy fix to this problem. We are seeing home construction occur. It's up 25% over a year ago. So that's good news, but it's still well below what we expect or what we need in order to really add to the stock of housing in a meaningful way. And we will have lingering challenges in the coming years. We've got households that are still going to have to resolve back payments for mortgages, back rent, things like that. And as these households work through these things, they're also having to reconcile the fact that they may have been on reduced wages over the last several months. So there are some challenges ahead for households. Of course, there also are challenges ahead for the property owners and the landlords because they have to work with their lenders to iron things out as well. We just need to keep in mind that California continues to have a serious chronic housing shortfall. On the left-hand side, you can see that from 1990 to 2020, population grew by about 43%. We also saw the economy grow and add jobs to the tune of 29%. But the housing stock only grew by 28% over that same time period. So, you know, it's a lot more complicated than what you're seeing on the screen, but the bottom line is that our production of housing simply hasn't kept up with the pace of population growth, nor with the pace of job growth. And so this is obviously a problem we've had for a long time, for many decades, something that won't be resolved overnight, but it's certainly something we're going to have to tackle just as soon as we get the pandemic behind us. So as we wrap up, we'll take a look at these questions one more time. When will we fully recover? By the end of this second quarter, we expect GDP to fully recover with growth expected over the next couple of years. The unemployment rate and jobs will recover sometime in 2022. Inflation is going to be elevated, as will interest rates. It's a manifestation of the recovery that we're in right now. But it's not something that's going to cause chronic worries going forward. We're concerned about the deficit, but it's something that we're going to have to set aside at the present time as we work through the recovery. But it is something, it's a matter that we should return to when the recovery is behind us and we're on a sounder footing. And California is recovering just a little bit more slowly than the U.S. right now, but it's going to outpace the U.S. economy before too long. And, you know, I just want to remind you that California punches above its weight when it comes to the U.S. economy. During the great expansion that took place prior to the pandemic, we contributed somewhere in the neighborhood of 16% of the jobs for the country that were added during that time period, when at the same time we only accounted for 12% of the job stock. So California definitely makes a major contribution to the U.S. and will continue to do so going forward. I thank you and wish you good morning.